sometimes toxic leaders are emulated. And that is how toxic culture in a company spreads lower down also, because the successor may also be toxic, because that is what seems to work. So to the question somebody was asking, what if it leads to success? That's an even deeper wound that people have to deal with.
Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. I'm Kiva and it's lovely to have you all join us today for this webinar series, The Future of Coaching. Before we get into the details about the webinar, it would be lovely to actually hear from all of you. If you could use the chat box and share with us which part of the world you're joining us from. Brilliant. So before we get started, I just want to take a minute to share with you all about something that we've been building up together at Coacharya, and today we are here to share that with you. So this year is Coacharya's, we're celebrating Coacharya's 10-year anniversary, and we wanted to make it special because we've got so much from the community and we've been able to, with the help of everyone, bring together a lot of learnings to the community. And so for this special celebration, we have launched a book. Yes, you heard that right. A very, very special book called Reflections on Coaching, an anthology. It is a tribute to the coaching profession by master coaches. And we want to, as part of the International Coaching Week, celebrate this with you, celebrate this book with you. And Yamini here has shared a link where if you click on the link, you can go ahead and download the ebook. And we hope you enjoy the book. This is something that we've put together collectively with master coaches from the community. So we hope you enjoy reading this book and do share with us any experiences that stayed with you, and do share it with your network, and hope the coaching community and the power that it brings to everybody in different spaces is something that you experience through this book. So welcome again. Hi, Neha. Sure. So we're going to get started with the webinar today. And the topic for the webinar today is toxic leadership and coaching. So coaching toxic leaders. And we have with us our host today, who is Coacharya's co-founder and CEO, Pranav, and our lovely guest, Gayatri, who is a leadership coach and a consultant. And they're going to be speaking to us about sharing their views and discuss with us about this topic. So over to you now, Pranav and Gayatri.
Thank you, Kiva. I think the best part of starting these webinars is seeing where everyone is coming from regionally, and not only is it different countries and cities, but different time zones. And for one, I'm pretty happy that it's not 4 a.m. in the morning for me, for a change. Thank you, Kiva, for not making me do that. But I am looking forward to our conversation, Gayatri. Toxic leadership is something that most of us have probably experienced at some level. We did a pre-poll on LinkedIn, and per the results of that sample, we had 97% of our survey saying that we have that they have experienced toxic leadership. So that means, based on, so we asked, so basically one person said that they hadn't experienced toxic leadership, and Gayatri's comment to that is maybe they're a toxic leader, so they're unaware that there is toxic leadership, and we can get into that in a second. But what I wanted to share personally is my own experience with toxic leadership. I'm both a recovering from toxic leadership, and perhaps even have been a toxic leader. I don't know. Those are things that I need to ask myself. But the instance that I remember, my first corporate job in America was walking into a room, a town hall, where the CEO was addressing the majority of the company, about 300 people. And this fellow walks in and says, his first line to us was, "You are all disposable." And he led with that. So that is without getting into the details, that was my first experience with toxic leadership. Gayatri, what was yours?
So the first experience of toxic leadership I had was, I had joined and I had only met this one boss, and the boss had gone off on a jaunt, official, for 10 days. So I had no idea what to do, and in retrospect, it felt toxic. At that time, I had nothing to do. I was reading books, and as you can see, I'm from an era when, in India, at least in the early 80s, when we didn't have PCs and mobile phones to keep us busy. So I used to take books from the library they had and read it. And after that, see, it's not that the person was fully toxic, but some of the toxic behaviors which I felt was, it was almost like I needed a weather forecast to find out what I'm going to encounter that day, whether it's going to be sunny, whether it's going to be a cloudy day, if it's going to rain. So had to do a lot of mood management, and always felt uncertain and sometimes quite small, because the criticism was loud and there was an expectation of followership. So as long as you're following, you're the good person. When you're not following, the treatment is different. So, and I'm sure many others have also felt this way. And maybe, like Kiva is saying, we can take the poll again to check. And if any one of you, have also, like the 97% of people we surveyed have encountered toxic behaviors, maybe you could get what did it make you feel, because that is what is important. As coaches, we want people to feel empowered, positive, happy. And when that doesn't happen, what can we do?
Yeah, and there's an unpredictability to it, right?
Yes,
that's what you're saying. So why don't we get into the causes? What do you think are the psychological effects of toxic leaders, generally?
So narcissism is a big part of it, because they think they are bigger than others, and it's all about themselves, So they lack the sense of empathy for others, and it's all about themselves, and they like themselves to be featured everywhere, and also the followership. You are in my good book if you follow me, but if you differ with me or work on something which is not in my agenda, then you're not part of it. It often also comes from a lack of self-esteem, because they don't know how to value themselves. It's always about what is coming from the outside. These are some of the things. And the third is the ultra competitiveness. So I am certified in Hogan assessments, and they talk about this overconfident, I can never do any wrong kind of an attitude that a toxic leader will have. What has been your experience, Pranav?
Yeah, before I share that, Kiva has the data from our most recent poll. Kiva, would you like to share the screen?
Yeah, and while Kiva is sharing, I can also read in the chat, things like anger, insecurity, insensitivity, and self-centered behavior, all of which I agree with. So here we don't have anyone who has not experienced toxic leadership. So of course, that makes it clear as to how important a topic it is for coaches.
Yeah, and thank you, Kiva, for sharing that. And perhaps I primed it a little too soon, but clearly we have no toxic leaders on this chat. I mean, on this on this webinar. Yeah, I think to answer your question, my experience has been similar. There are elements of power that come from a narcissistic behavior, personality disorders, but the other type of toxic behavior I've also noticed is, and I think maybe I have succumbed to this as well, is being in a toxic environment. There's sort of a nurturing that happens. So there's two things. One is that there's trauma. So if you've been managed by toxic leaders, you are therefore now there's a rite of passage that you want to pass on to others in your career trajectory. And it's almost sort of a nurturing that you are told, you think that's what is right. That's an interesting way of it manifesting itself.
Yeah, so poor communication is a hallmark of toxic leaders. It's always a one-way communication. There is no change in it just because there is some feedback on saying that it's not working. So when a leader says something and it's misinterpreted, it's always misinterpreted. It's never wrong. They cannot accept fault, and that way they're very poor communicators. And the inconsistency is there in all these behaviors, including in communication, and manipulation, feeding information, withholding information, not letting people know where you stand. These are all some of the behaviors which is very common. And the one which is now being spoken about a lot is microaggression. Like suppose I'm in a group of people who are doing business development, and I'm very gently told, you should play golf so that you can develop business better. That's toxic. That's expecting you to behave like me and sending a message that you're not doing all that you can.
Yeah.
And I think microaggression, in our conversation, you also talked about it a lot, Pranav. Maybe you can shed a little bit more light on it, because maybe because of the toxic leadership that I experienced, I've been on my own for 30 years. So
sure. Yeah. Microaggressions certainly, I think, are a way of subtly communicating toxicity. I want to just hold that thought for a second, because the chat box is buzzing a lot, and I want to make sure that we address some of that. Kiva, just ping us if you feel we haven't touched on a topic that's being commented about. One thing that was asked. Sorry.
Yeah, I noticed something. So they're talking about how do you see gender and narcissism playing out. I am not sure there is much of gender difference in terms of who is toxic, but I have read some research saying that women are more prone to absorbing the toxicity because they feel it more. Yeah. So maybe true, maybe not true. Maybe the people in the group can shed some light on that. But as far as it can be of any gender. But yes.
Yeah, it can be of any gender. And I think there are subcultures that are created within organizations that are regional and function oriented and gender, and you could have a healthy culture overall, but in those subcultures, there could be toxicity, like women are treated a certain way, or people in a certain country are treated a certain way. The one question that I wanted to address first was what's the definition of toxic leadership? I think Jennifer Cohen asked that question. And in some of the research I was doing, an article from the MIT Management Review had a good way of positing the 5 attributes. They call it the toxic 5. And those are disrespect, non-inclusivity in terms of gender, race, sexual identity, orientation, disability, age, cronyism, and nepotism, being unethical, being cutthroat, and being abusive. Those by far are the top 5 traits of toxic leadership.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about microaggressions, yeah, it's interesting. You know, when we were doing our pre-chat, we talked a little bit about a concept that I found really interesting that you brought up, which is stealth. So the stealth toxic leader, right? So it is, are you, what does that mean? The subtle toxicity, actively toxic, or are you passively complicit? And
So
yeah,
you're not just complicit, they are actually toxic, but the manifestation is different. So they may not be the one who will abuse by shouting. They may abuse you by ignoring you, or, you know, just not letting you into the group, you know, keeping you out of meetings, etc. So it's like a punishment, which is not very overt, but it is very covered. So in the beginning, you don't see it because the usual drama which is there with the toxic leader is not there. So they are not the bold, confident people who will strike the cross and command, but they will do it more subtly, which is equally difficult to handle and little more difficult to detect, you know. So that is what I meant by stealth toxicity, because it is, I think microaggression is a large part of that stealth toxicity. Small little hints, you know. So for example, say, oh, you've done so well, so please do this also. You're not really giving a compliment, you're overloading that person, you know. And you will realize it probably later, because initially it's like maybe, you know, naively feeling good about it, but later you may just be the one getting overloaded, you know. And then the rest of it about unfairness, etc., is part of the stealth toxicity also.
sure. So what is the way to identify that behavior, right? So, you know, you said that. I've had that too. I had a boss come to me once and say, you are the best person to do this job. And it was literally the most menial job that one could possibly do. But at the time I felt recognized. I was, you know, 18 years old. I don't know, looking for validation and affirmation. So he manipulated that. How does one know?
So my gut instinct tells me that when you feel it within yourself, you don't want to go to work, you know, you're kind of on tenterhooks all the time. So the anxiety level, as it increases, possible that, you know, you're experiencing toxic leadership. Of course, anxiety can have other elements also, but if you're just a, you know, happy-go-lucky person going to work and suddenly you get all these feelings of anxiety, there may be toxicity. And I think it's not easy, but setting boundaries is important. Expectation setting and asking, you know, if I'm doing, and looking around also to see what it is, because I don't think toxic leaders are partial in terms of who they will be toxic to, except in terms of, you know, if you like me and follow me, you're in my good books. If you don't, you're not in my good books. So to recognize it, I think requires a lot of self-reflection, and it is not easy to get out of it. It's just like any other abusive relationship. But I'm not a psychologist, so if, you know.
So that goes back to the idea of nurture, right? It goes back to nurture, which is in an abusive relationship, and this is psychological, but so we're not therapists, but it applies. You are primed to understand a behavior in a certain way. So if someone's abusive to you as you're growing up, you think of that person's care and love as even though it's abusive, you think abusive people are loving you. And if you're starting, or a career 17, 18, or even younger, and someone is an abusive boss, then you assume that's how it is, which is probably true for me in some instances, and maybe others as well. So the question is, when you first start talking about stealth toxicity, it made me self-conscious. And it made me think about whether or not whether I've done it. And I assume the 81 of us on this call here are also maybe thinking about that for a second or reflecting on it. I mean, how do we unearth and perhaps even correct the toxic leader in each one of us?
So I have, of course, like I said, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm going to use a little bit of my knowledge on transaction analysis. So a toxic leader is generally in the avatar of a controlling parent. They tell you what to do, and then they tell you that it is for your own good. So they are never adult to adult, and seldom will they come down to the child level. So they're always in that controlling parent. So they will tell you what to do, and so you have to be good to them because it's all for your good. I'm the parent, right? I know best. So I know what you want also. So if you say, I want something, I say, no, this is what you should want. So that is what is the controlling parent. So I suppose if you reflect and find yourself doing that, saying that I know what you should want, or as a coach, sometimes we get into, this is not a great goal, that's a better goal. Maybe, elements of it is coming through.
Okay.
So Raj has written that they can be a rebellious child too. I personally feel that it is a reaction to the controlling parent. So, toxic leaders must have had toxic elements in their life also, right? So I think it's a good time to go and check, having reflected, like, am I excluding someone? Am I giving someone the silent treatment? So maybe, you can go to the poll and check out and answer the question about have you exhibited toxic leadership traits? I definitely have. I have.
So I think, so I think the poll will give us some answers, and I think everyone perhaps is even thinking about this question. There was an interesting question just posed, whether aggressive leadership is considered toxic leadership. What do you think, Gayatri?
It's a telltale sign, but not necessarily toxic leadership. If the aggressive leader is taking along people and they're all growing together, and there is fairness, maybe it's not toxic. It may be very overwhelming, but there is you're on an express train going very fast. So you're used to going in a passenger train or very slow. So it's a little different, but need not be toxic. But when the aggressive leader gets used to wins and finds that they are not as successful, toxicity often creeps in. Does that make sense? You're used to winning, and then when you're not, you start treating people around you in a different way.
Yeah, and there was an excerpt that I thought was relevant, and I made a mental note of it, which is that leadership requires followers. It's an interaction, not an action, which sort of sums up what you just said. Kiva, what do you want to share that the results of that most recent poll, which is, have you exhibited toxic leadership traits?
Yeah. And there was a question from Veena asking whether these toxic traits helped one gain success. They often do. especially at the beginning, when you're going aggressively. But when you have to lead a larger team, or there's then it becomes more difficult.
So that it's an interesting result. The majority of us do think we have exhibited toxic leadership traits.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kiva. We talked a little bit about how toxicity, and we're going to get to the whole, how do we deal with it in the next half of this, but I'm still trying to dissect and analyze what the causes are, right? And there was a correlation to Maslow's hierarchy in one of the articles that we were researching. Do you want to get into that, Gayatri? Should I prime it for you?
I guess no. It depends on. I don't think they're at a self-actualization level for sure. They're still in a rat race where they're trying to find their feet. They want more and more and more of something which is generally very material. It's position, it's power, it's money. So they're definitely at a lower level. And when success doesn't come, they can slip back to a lower level. What's your take on that, Pranav?
Exactly that is not, they have not self-actualized their behavior. They're operating at the survival level, right? And which means they haven't progressed internally. There's not enough self-awareness. There's so many things there. Right? They haven't been through enough therapy. I don't know, but I think that's what gets us into the next step of this is, what can we do? How, as coaches, when we are presented with a toxic leader, what can we do? Or how do we approach this?
Right. So if the person is a toxic, has exhibited, let's call it as exhibiting toxicity and not a toxic leader who is the epitome of toxicity, because they may not come to a coach. A coach or therapist cannot teach them much. But if they have come, there will be areas where they want to improve, So a lot of it is about communication, and we talk of, this a non-violent communication, where you talk of things like how do you convey things, in terms of the way you use words and how you can communicate without being aggressive. And of course, empathy. Now, I have also wondered, because some toxic leaders, and we've seen them, right? You have the photo, there was one political leader who insisted that his photo be carried in the Olympics every time the country men won a medal. So they will stand there on the podium and show the picture of that person, because that was how important, it was. The second is, I don't know, we may encounter more people who are at the receiving end of the toxic leaders. And for them, of course, a couple of things. It's almost like I said, an abusive relationship. What are you getting out of it? Can you leave it? The second is, to handle it is actually have a little empathy in terms of trying to find out where that person is coming from. Where is that toxic leader coming from? And if the person you're coaching is the toxic leader, same empathy for that person as to where are they coming from, and can they see that, what has got them here won't get them to the next level. Often, very cataclysmic events can change a person. And Steve Jobs is the example which is given a lot. He had a lot of toxic leadership qualities, and he was asked to go. But that being asked to go from a company you set up was an event. So when he came back to Apple, he had changed his behavior a lot. And of course, other events like health scares can also change a person's behavior. So I personally don't think I've had anybody who's full of toxicity. There will be toxic elements like communication. Why are you not sharing? What will happen if you share? Or a fear that, if I groom somebody else, I may lose my job. The feeling of indispensability will go away. So I think dealing with those elements little by little is the way I would go. But we see, Kiva has been saying master coaches. We have master of master coach Cindy also on this webinar. Maybe Cindy can write and tell us a little bit about has she encountered in her coaching any toxic leaders. Of course, all of you are also welcome to put in your experience of really toxic leader. Now, if I were to coach a toxic leader and they're just not willing to invest or take any, be ready to share perspective or invest in themselves to become better, I will not continue the coaching, because you cannot, it's not a one-sided thing, right?
Yeah. And there were a couple of things that stuck out to me. It's surmised. You summarized a little some parts of that. One is that I think there's a spectrum of toxicity, right?
Yeah.
So there was a quote from one of the articles, in fact, that I believe you had written. The difference between an incorrigible narcissist and a humble narcissist is the ability to empathize, at least in small doses.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, there's a spectrum of that, right? It's not always 100%.
Yes, it is not 100%. Some people will realize that there are, so suppose I realize that this person is key to me, whether or not they are a yes man or a yes woman, or then I may behave better with them. So it is a bit of preying on the vulnerable. If you look for approval, if you're the type who wants that affirmation, chances of you're getting into that toxic relationship with the boss, where they are able to manipulate you, is, I think, higher. And that is why when you're if your first boss is a toxic boss, it's a very rough beginning. Karthik has asked about a question which I'll just read out. How do you differentiate between element of controlling versus situation leadership concept of S1 quadrant, which requires individual to give instruction depending upon employee who is new and learning? Is it controlling behavior to some extent? So the quadrants depend on will and skill, right? So it's a question of, is there a context to the whole thing? Why are you doing this? Can they go from this quadrant to some other quadrant later? So if it is done with the explanation, or, why are we doing it and what is in it for the other person, and that is where the difference will come. Otherwise, yes, it is a controlling, directing behavior, which is needed at that point, because, the skill level is very low. But are you increasing the skill level, or are you keeping them in that quadrant? And I think that is where the difference would be. It's like, not letting anybody, one person really scale up so they know a lot of things, and keep them all in different jobs and not let them know what each other is doing. That would be controlling. That's my, okay.
So let's pause there so that Kiva can share the results of toxic traits. This should be interesting. Go ahead, Kiva.
So
I'm going to try and catch up on all the questions that are being asked.
So I like what Tani is saying that criminals select their victims carefully. Indeed, that is true. And I'm sorry about, he's also saying, check their behavior through routine activity theory. I have no idea what that theory is. I'm so sorry. So maybe a little bit more if you can write about it. And second is, how do you handle it yourself? You develop yourself. Go to somebody, some mentor, someone else who can, reflect with you and tell you how to do it. Okay. So what traits?
So this is
okay.
go ahead, Guy.
Ignoring seems to be the silent treatment. I think it happens in families all the time, which also tells us that it's not just workplaces which can be toxic. As we all know, even the home life can also be toxic. And the narcissism is not a big deal, but yeah, I think they're all very valid points. And what bad language, yes. So I know I may be a little bit unpopular if I say that. If you see Virat Kohli during IPL, he uses a lot of bad language in a language which perhaps is not English, but yes, it happens. And sometimes some people do it to motivate themselves, going all gung-ho. But yes, that body language is also very in your face, manipulation, not listening, selective listening, turning your words against you.
Right.
Especially with this, all these things about fake news and fake things. So they can just attribute words to you and turn it around. So yes, attention hogging. Yes, very, very true. Yeah. Yes, Pranav, maybe you can comment on the things.
Yeah, it just seeing all the words there, it's interesting. Perhaps this session is allowing people to vent in some ways. It's maybe therapeutic for them as well. The thing that I was wanting to touch upon, and then we can go more into the coaching of toxic leaders or the victims of toxic leadership, is that there's a lot more transparency in this regard, right? So between the millennial and zillennial generations being more open and advocates of their own wellness and well-being in the workplace and remote working and things like social media, and then things like Glassdoor, where you can go and look up a company's reviews. And you can immediately tell if they're a toxic company or not. And it's right there, right? So, to the extent that it has influenced the Great Resignation, and how employees are perceiving the workplace, there's a major shift, right? Culturally.
Yeah, there is a shift, but on the other hand, because of the social media, etc., people want instant gratification. So if they are not noticed instantly, they feel bad, So I think there is some element which helps the toxic leader influence them more. And if they are very well known, like, for example, let me take the examples of, say, a professional college alumni group. Everybody gravitates towards the well-known person because they want to be like that. So sometimes toxic leaders are emulated. And that is how toxic culture in a company spreads lower down also, because the successor may also be toxic because that is what seems to work. So to the question somebody was asking, what if it leads to success? That's an even deeper wound that people have to deal with, So they have the advantage of being able to, it's like being hyperlinked, right? So one bad behavior and you're known everywhere. Now, if you're the type who is reflecting, taking that feedback, it can be bad. It's not good for you. But if you're the type who will ignore that or turn it around, whatever Glassdoor does doesn't matter. You can say that, hey, my stock has gone up 50%. How does it matter what these people say? And these are all disgruntled employees. You can spin it around.
Right.
So it works. I think there are two sides of the coin to this because of the way the need for visibility. So, how many likes are you getting on a post? How many people are reading? Who is, sharing? And I have to be honest. I think at some level we all manipulate that, right? Like, if I want my post to be read, or if I want this webinar to be attended by more people, I'll call my friend and say, I'm going to post this, like it, and make sure that you share it. That's all manipulation, right? And it's maybe a smaller level, but manipulation is something which is at the heart of toxic leadership. They try to manipulate the environment, the people. Yes.
I think the idea, the sentiment here is that it's a selfish behavior, right? So someone did ask that. What if it's contributing to their success? Well, yes, it's contributing to their success, their individual success, not the success of the people around them, which is not necessarily a leadership trait that, say, a leadership development firm like Coacharya would want to encourage, right? So there's also the idea that it's a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. There's a chance for it to be a win-win for all those involved. And then I think that it's also the motivation of your employees. Are they going to be more motivated because they're suppressed and subjugated, or are they going to be more motivated if they're happy to go to work and energized?
Right. And there's a question whether favoritism is considered a toxic behavior. See, favoritism, let me put a different spin to it. Favoritism can be perceived because of lack of knowledge. Okay, I'm being promoted or I'm not being promoted, that person is being promoted. It may be that you just didn't know the amount of work they did, because they're not communicating, they're not telling you the benchmarks, etc. Deliberately favoring someone so that, they can hurt another person, that would be a toxic behavior. But I suppose we all have a little bit of favoritism creeps into everything, right? As long as it doesn't overwhelm other things, that is fine. So if we can have expectations set, if we can have benchmarks for different behaviors, what will be, considered good work, and there is communication and openness, the favoritism will reduce. So favoritism, perceived favoritism, I would say, need not be toxic, but yes, toxic people always favor one, and divide and rule is a great methodology for toxic leaders to thrive.
Yeah, and the cronyism and nepotism are listed as toxic behaviors, and I think that more at a systemic level, right? We're all prone to favoritism. I have two daughters, and I have to admit that one of them might be a little more of my favorite than the other. But I think at a systemic level, when that happens, that's when it's dysfunctional. There was a comment posted that I want to go back to the idea that while there may be a generally healthy culture in an organization, there can be subcultures or microcultures that are toxic, right? Yeah. So how do you treat minorities within a company? How do you treat women within a company? We talk about microaggressions. So when you go into a room full of, or a mix of men and women, and you say, hey guys, is that appropriate anymore, right? Does that consider toxic? So there's so many nuances to this at this situation at this point. There's also regional. There was a question about, does the culture of a country affect toxicity? And there may be different rules for that in different countries regionally, right? You're talking to me from India. I'm talking to you from the US. There are different variables at play here that go beyond gender and age. There's race, and in India there's class, and so there's so many different ways that it can play itself out in the ecosystem.
So it's just that, even ignorance can come across as toxic. So suppose I'm talking to someone in US and they say, oh, you speak good English. It's microaggression. What do you mean? It's like, so sometimes cultural differences can happen, but they will get sorted out with communication, And somebody had also written that, people are selectively toxic. Yeah, it's like the killers finding their victims. They prey on the vulnerable. So if they find that you are not as confident or you are more dependent, like suppose I'm in a job where I can say, okay, I don't want this job. My boss will be more cognizant of that, right? Because I may just suddenly leave. It's not as that like Trump was saying, you're fired. No, before that I will leave. And the company will suffer more than me. But if I'm dependent on that job or I have insecurity, I am in a vulnerable position. And yes, preying on the vulnerable is another technique which toxic leaders use, So, yeah. So, another poll before we close. Sure. Let's do it.
And the questions in the last sort of quarter of this webinar, the questions are being asked around how to coach toxic leaders. And I assuming many of us here are coaches, that's pertinent.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I think if you're dealing with a toxic leader, documenting is very important, because you can't, like, suppose it comes to a case of sexual harassment. It's all about what is there documented, right? It can't be just, I said it, you said it, without any documentation. So if you feel it, you should bring it up, but have a plan B. If needed, I think leaving is the option which should always be in someone's mind. It is not the be all and end all. There are many other settings, companies, even families, right? If you're in a toxic family, in an abusive relationship, people find it difficult to leave it. I think they go through the same thing. And
so the first step is to create an awareness, right? The first step is for them to acknowledge.
Yes. Yeah. And
right.
I keep talking about expectation sharing, because when I started my work, we used to do this thing called organization socialization, where we used to have the manager and the person coming and say, what do you want me to do? What will you do for me in return? It's a kind of conversation which, if it is had at the beginning, will set the tone properly, saying that it's a mutual relationship. It is not one lording over the other. But for that, of course, you need a lot of confidence and clarity, about what you want to do. So, Shiva, has the poll been ready? Can you all share the link so that, because of course, finding out whether I am toxic is very difficult, but I guess looking at the feedback and perception of how others behave would definitely, okay. So we have, we'll wait for a few more responses, Kiva.
Yeah. Well, so the second half of the question is, how do we coach the victims or the recipients of toxic leadership? And ostensibly, based on the first poll, that's 100% of us on this call. So what are your thoughts around that?
So I feel that, as a coach, if you can teach them self-empathy first, like they talk about in a airplane, give yourself some oxygen and then go treat others. So look at yourself. What is it doing to you? Have empathy about yourself. Okay. And then look at it, maybe a little bit of empathy for the person, saying that, okay, I know why they're doing, so now I can let go and not let that toxic leader have so much influence on my life, you know. So it's just a question of realizing that you're about this, and it's and also that it's not you who's making the leader toxic, because people will come and say, you know, when there is a lot of anger and you made me angry. No, you decided to get angry. Okay, so differentiate as to who is the victim, because toxic leaders often play the card of victimhood, saying, I'm the victim here, what's wrong? I mean, you're fine. You know, so maybe bring up some of those things, you know, teaching them to have self-empathy, because that will help you later have empathy with others.
Okay. We have a few minutes left, so I wanted to make sure we addressed any questions that there were, and feel free to post them. The quote that I'm sort of leaning on here right now, I'm going to repeat it. I said it in a slightly different way earlier, which is that you know, leadership is often treated as an action by the leader directed toward or against others. More appropriately, we should view leadership as an interaction between leaders and their followers.
Yes, definitely.
It goes back to that whole idea of the servant leadership, which probably is not an appropriate term anymore, but it is. It's yes, I'll post that in the chat. The idea is that we need to have a paradigm shift in the way we think of leadership, right? And how we're framing it. I'm posting that. Do you think this will happen?
I think it's happening sometimes because the other option is not working. You know, people are quitting, you need to keep them engaged. And when people quit, the guys or girls and others you want to keep are the ones quitting. You know, look at Twitter. That's absolute, I mean, to me, it's very toxic. But I don't know what people who have still retained their jobs think of it. But that kind of, you know, haphazard, unpredictable, absolutely like no empathy, right, with the person. So, for example, I read some notes about how Twitter is reducing its paternity leave, you know. So on one hand, Elon Musk is someone who's been known to say that, you know, we need more people. The population should increase. On the other hand, he's also talking about paternity leave, because that is the philosophy he spouts. But reality is that for him, that time is your time is my time, because I'm paying for it. You know, so I own you, kind of, as long as you work for me. So, yeah. So, okay, this is just a logistical thing. George is asking whether there's a way to copy the chat. So when the recording is shared, I think you can see the chat also, isn't it, Kiva?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the recording, but I did say the quote, so it should be
okay.
Should be apparent.
Okay, I
well,
think
the
webinar host may be able to see it. So yeah.
Go
ahead.
And perhaps we can find a way to release some of the quotes that, you know, we were addressing here in some form, okay, in a blog post or similar. But I think maybe as we just wind up here, Gayatri, do you want to have any sort of last words on toxic leaderships. I mean, we could have taken any one of these ideas. We kind of, went through it in a elliptical manner, but any one of these topics could be
like an amoeba, we went in all directions. Let's coagulate to the center now. So my feeling is that even those who have not coached toxic leaders will be able to detect toxicity, and many of the people we coach who are in a leadership position will respond positively when it is pointed out to them that, hey, you think this is the way to deal. Maybe it is seen in a toxic manner by another. So for example, I have coached leaders who are very ambitious, and they're like, I don't understand. They have so much they can rise to such a height. So I tell them, maybe they have other ambition in another line. So don't, think that my person reporting to me has to be a clone of what I did, because what I did has worked so well. So that is the template. So I think coaching leaders to know that there is no such template and to be more open-minded is something which, even if they're not toxic leaders at that level, they will become better leaders if they're able to see the warning signs of becoming toxic. Does that make sense, Pranav?
That makes sense. It goes back to self-awareness, right? So I think what might be interesting to do is, since there were a lot of questions on this, specifically how to react to such situations, that we can do a follow-up, a sequel to this webinar that has a deep dive into that specific topic. And maybe we can even sort of simulate a toxic leadership coaching session or so. So I do know that the team wants to wrap up here, but Gayatri, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and for educating me on toxic leadership, and making me aware of my own toxicity that perhaps exists. And I hope that
so there is a little bit of toxicity to Harish's thing. Yes, we must not label people as toxic, just like, the positive labels, the negative labels have to be very carefully dealt with. So, yes.
Yes, correct. So, and it is a spectrum, right? So it's, we're all humans at the end of the day, and that's what it is. But I think it is hopefully also been generative for the audience to listen and reflect on both their own versions of toxicity in themselves or in others, and we can keep this conversation going, because clearly this will be a relevant topic for the years to come. With that, thank you so much, Gayatri. Kiva, would you like to take over?
And thank you for the invite, Pranav and Kiva.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much, Gayatri and Pranav. That was a very interesting conversation, very eye-opening, and I think the chat box was buzzing. So a big thank you to all our participants also for engaging continuously and for sharing their thoughts and for asking all the questions that you did. So we'll surely get back to you all with maybe a follow-up webinar session like Pranav shared a while back. So we'll stay in touch with you about that. Just as we are closing out, just one or two announcements for all of you. So you must have received an email from us last week about a new learning opportunity with us. So we have kickstarted the thought leadership groups on our community platform called Coach Nook. It's absolutely free, and we have 3 facilitators who are leading 3 specific groups. So Yamini is going to share the links for you to sign up. So just take a minute and explore if this is something you'd enjoy. We also have a bunch of coaching foundation courses lined up for May and June. And if you are new to the coaching space and want to know more about these courses, you can write to us at contact@coacharya.com. And if you're already a coach looking to move to mastery, we have a Coacharya Mastery program planned for June with our program director, Cindy. And feel free to connect with us if you want to know more about that course. You can also connect with Cindy directly at cindy@coacharya.com. So thank you so much once again, Gayatri and Pranav. It was a very, very interesting conversation, and a big thank you to our participants again. And we hope to see you again next week at the same time. See you all.
And you have that email ID community@coacharya.com. So keep the conversation going. And if there's anything on this topic, share it with me, and maybe we can put the answers together and mail them to all the participants. So
that would be great, Gayatri. Thank you so much. Thank you all. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.